All right, family, episode number 98, the Manifold Grace of God. Since grace is at the very heart, indeed is the very foundation and fountain of true Christianity, we should have a better grasp of this important word and its truth. Furthermore, the doctrine of God's grace in Christ is multi-sided. As a doctrine of the word, it touches every area of truth or doctrine in one way or another. Every aspect of doctrine is related to grace. It is no wonder grace is an important word and one that Paul desires to be experienced by all. It is a fountain from which we must all drink deeply, but it is one that runs counter to our own natural tendencies. Rather than drink from God's fountain, we tend to build our own broken cisterns. 1 Peter 4:10, I believe, is a gateway to a deeper understanding of the grace of God, because we define grace as unearned, unmerited, undeserved favor. But some will ask, how does this apply to my regular everyday life? And I'm sure there's a lot of preachers that probably say, how do you preach something like that every single week? Every time you get to a pulpit, how do you preach something like that? But grace, even though that is the proper biblical definition, can also be defined by the things that it causes and the effects of God's grace, meaning joy, pleasure, delight, gratification, favor, acceptance, healing, wisdom. All these things, amongst many others, are all the effects of this amazing grace of God. 1 Peter 4:10 reads, as every man hath received a gift, even so minister the same one to another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Manifold can mean many-sided, variegated, multicolored. 1 Peter 4:10 in the WEB version says, as each has received a gift, employ it in serving one another as good managers of the grace of God in its various forms. Now, this grace in its various forms means the different aspects and the functions and the operation of God's grace in the life of a believer. And how you define and how you understand grace will make or break your understanding of the Bible. It will make or break your Christian walk. So know this, people of God, grace is everything. Grace is the source of all things pertaining to the believer. So when we take a look at the New Testament, when we're looking through these details and these verses and these expressions of how this manifold grace of God, these various forms of grace of God, these things are clearly, explicitly detailed for us. And it's almost troubling how we get people that are fighting this grace message or this grace of God, however you want to define it, when we have things that are, are in direct conflict with the accusations that are made against this gospel of grace. So let's just jump to Titus chapter 2, verse 12 says, teaching us that denying ungodliness and worldly lusts, we should live soberly, righteously, and godly in this present world. Grace is a teacher. Grace teaches us. 2 Corinthians chapter 12, verse 9. But he has said to me, my grace is sufficient for you. My loving kindness and my mercy are more than enough. Always available, regardless of the situation. For my power is being perfected and is completed and shows itself most effectively in your weakness. Therefore, I will all the more gladly boast in my weaknesses so that the power of Christ may completely enfold me and may dwell in me. 2 Corinthians 12, verse 9 is telling us that grace is the power of God that strengthens our weaknesses. 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verse 10. But by the grace of God, I am what I am. And his grace to me was not without effect. No, I worked harder than them all. Yet not I, but the grace of God that was in me. Grace will make us passionate for God. Acts chapter 6, verse 8. Now Stephen, a man full of God's grace and power, performed great wonders and signs among the people. People of God, grace produces signs and wonders. Romans chapter 6, verse 14. For sin shall not have dominion over you, for ye are not under the law, but under grace. Grace suppresses sin. Now, I just took a couple of samples out of the New Testament just to get a feel for what we're talking about when we're talking about this manifold grace of God. We're talking about the various forms of God's grace and its operation and the functioning in the life of a believer. And I think about all those verses I just read. There's something about that Romans 6:14, because the people that oppose this grace message, oppose this grace of God, the leg that they stand on is that you're telling people it's okay to sin. And there's something about this where, and I've seen people try to make sense or try to reason away with Romans 6:14, the truth of Romans 6:14. Sin shall not have dominion over you. Sin will not dominate you because you're not under the law, but under grace. So because this says the opposite, what these people are saying that oppose grace, and because this verse is like so direct and explicit in what it's saying, in the most gentle way, I could say that anybody that is saying that grace is a license to sin has a veil over their eyes. In the most harshest, strongest terms, I would say that people are saying that the grace of God is a license to sin is somebody that's probably under a demonic spell. But I'm going to choose the more gentle side and just say they have a veil over their eyes. But I don't know what this is about, where we have people that are strong and mature in God that are fighting against things that are clearly and directly expressed. I don't know. And it can't make sense. I think that's why you can't make sense out of it, because of the source for where that mindset comes from. So I'm just going to leave it at that and just go on to my next part. So these are just New Testament samples that I have for this manifold grace of God. And then when I go to the Old Testament, I got to go to my favorite parts of the scriptures, y'all. Y'all know they used to say that, I read that was something that they said about Martin Luther, where he liked to repeat many things. There were certain things that he liked to repeat over and over. And I get excited when I start talking about this story of Abraham and zeroing on certain these chapters. And this is something that I taught about before. I'm gonna add a little bit, some extra revelations to some of these chapters. But when we're watching Abraham and we look through these chapters, starting at chapter 15 and forward, we're watching this manifold grace of God. We're watching this various forms of God. And it's Genesis 17 that is the game changer. Word of faith. Word of faith. I'm a word of faith boy. Y'all coming from these word of faith circles. Genesis 17, I had two things. In this journey of this grace message, there's two things that changed everything for me. Number one, when they told me that the word sin is sometimes a noun, sometimes a verb. That's the number one thing that got me, because it changes the whole Bible. Number two, because I'm a faith boy, and I looked at and I found out the difference between Abram and Abraham, Sarai and Sarah, and this grace, this changes everything. It's a game changer. So I'm gonna walk through these chapters. I know I've done this before, but I think I've added a couple of hidden revelations, because the way this is designed is so rich and full of revelation. I can't do this in one setting. I can't do it in an hour. So the things that I'm giving you, I pray that this provokes you to go back and study and read and dig and look through these chapters and just look at it differently. Because the way I'm setting you up in 15, 16, and 17, then you can walk through 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, and walk through those chapters and just extract these spiritual nutrients and vitamins. This is how you study the word of God, people. I try to present this thing so that people, are intrigued and provoked, and they say, I got to go look and study. This is something different. And I just pray that it hits you that way. So Genesis 15, verse 6 says, and he believed in the Lord, and he counted it to him for righteousness. So Genesis 15:5 is when God preached the gospel. Genesis 15:6 says Abraham believed God and it was accounted to him for righteousness, which is the very definition of the gospel. If you believe and have faith in Jesus Christ, God then imparts Jesus Christ's righteousness and perfection to you apart from works. So you are right with God and you have perfect standing with God apart from what you do or don't do. This is the very definition of the gospel. Genesis 16 verse 1 says, now Sarai, Abram's wife, bare him no children, and she had a handmaid, an Egyptian, whose name was Hagar. So Genesis 16 is when we're introduced to Hagar and Ishmael. Remember, Paul tells us plainly that Hagar and Sarah are a symbolic picture or an allegory of the covenants. Hagar represents the law, Sarah represents grace. So in Genesis 16, we're watching Abram, who is a righteous man. He's a believer, he's right with God, but he's trying to obtain the promises of God in his own strength, in his own might, and with his own effort, which is what the law represents. And this in turn produces Ishmael. So in order to capture the full revelation of Genesis 16, we have to look at the life of Hagar and the life of Ishmael in order to understand what happens to a believer when he's trying to obtain the promises of God in his own strength. Genesis 17, Abram's name is now changed to Abraham. Sarai's name is now changed to Sarah. For those of us that come from Word of Faith circles, this is the chapter that is used as a blueprint for the principles of faith, believing and speaking. I'm not here to tear down any of the faith teachers or any of the principles of faith that we've been taught. But the reality is we were taught faith without the main ingredient. When you look at the difference between Abram and Abraham, the only difference in his name is the fifth letter of the Hebrew alphabet, and it is He, which means grace. When we look at the difference between Sarai and Sarah, the difference between the two is a little different because there's an exchange or a replacement. So you got the 10th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, Yud, is now replaced with the 5th letter of the Hebrew alphabet, He, which means grace. So when we're looking at Genesis 17, we're looking at this impartation of grace into the life of Abram and Abraham, which is now setting us up for all the next following chapters. So after chapter 17, we're now watching the manifold grace of God. We're now watching the various forms of God's grace in motion. Genesis 18. So watch it. Watch it. Verse 1. The very first verse after chapter 17. Watch it. The Lord appeared to Abraham near the great trees of Mamre while he was sitting at the entrance to his tent in the heat of the day. Mamre in Hebrew means strength and fatness. Fatness always represents richness, goodness, and prosperity. So when we're talking about Abraham is now in Mamre, that means Abraham is now in a place of strength and prosperity, which means this is what we're talking about when we say health and wealth. I know they're trying to put a dirty spin on that health and wealth phrase now, but it is of God and it is in the scriptures. So as soon as we see this impartation of grace, the first thing that we see is Abraham is now in a place of health and wholeness, richness, goodness, and prosperity. Genesis 18 is when Abraham and Sarah are promised Isaac. This is their dream. This is their heart's desire, to have their own son, to have someone that they can pass their inheritance to. But also in Genesis 18 and continuing into Genesis 19 is the story of Lot. I almost got sidetracked when I was putting this together because when I'm looking at Lot, there's so much revelation in these chapters. I almost have to deal with this in another topic on another subject, but I'm going to touch on it briefly. We know Abraham has this impartation of grace, and it says that in Genesis 18, he is interceding for Sodom and Lot. Lot, the name Lot in Hebrew means a veil. So I believe this represents believers that have this veil over their eyes. This represents believers that can't see God's grace. So when you could be a righteous man, heaven bound, but you don't have this force of grace. You don't have this manifold grace of God in its various forms operating and functioning in your life. So now you're making moves and you're making choices without this force of grace in your life, and you can end up somewhere you don't want to go, and you can end up doing things you don't want to do. Because one thing that we do know when it comes to Sodom and Gomorrah, because it's all well documented, in the end, Lot and his family, they were corrupted by the immorality that was going on in this city. And it took the prayers of Abraham to save Lot from destruction. So everything that we see about Abraham and everything that we read and that we've been taught, the prayers of the righteous availeth much. Abraham is interceding, he's interceding for his brothers and his sisters, for his brethren. This is talking about having the covering, having people around you. But when it comes to Abraham operating in these things, when he's in this prayer and in this covering and this interceding, are the people that are praying for you, interceding for you, and covering you, do they have the revelation of God's grace? So in Genesis 19, it says, verse 29, but God had listened to Abraham's requests and kept Lot safe, removing him from the disaster that engulfed the cities of the plain. So Lot escaped death and destruction because of Abraham. Genesis chapter 20. This is a nightmare for the religious folks. This is a nightmare for the God's going to get you folks. I think we all know the story. This is when Abraham lies to Abimelech and offers him Sarah, his wife. He says, hey, that's not my wife, that's my sister. Some reason Abraham has a habit of doing this. This is something that is clear and obvious in the scriptures. But interestingly, though, God never confronts or rebukes Abraham for this sin. I'm not giving anyone a license to sin or permission to continue in sin. But the reality is God rescued Abraham from the consequences of his sin. This is telling us that sin consciousness, condemnation, and judgment is not God's way, and it will not stop people from sinning. We also see that fear is what the root was to Abraham's sin. Abraham does not have confidence in God's protection and provision. God's protection with no rebuke did not move Abraham to continue in sin. Instead, he was grateful for what God had done for him. At times, we all fall in sin, but grace will not allow you to be comfortable in sin. You will want to get out of sin and not go back to it once God delivers you. Like I said, this is a nightmare for these religious folks, because look how this situation turns out for Abraham. Remember, Abraham is the bad guy here. He told a lie, and God did not confront Abraham. He confronted Abimelech. And this is how the situation unfolded. People of God, we're talking about the manifold grace of God. Verse 14, then Abimelech took some of his sheep and goats, cattle, and male and female servants, and presented them to Abraham. He also returned his wife Sarah to him. Then Abimelech said, look over my land and choose any place where you would like to live. And he said to Sarah, look, I am giving your brother 1,000 pieces of silver in the presence of all these witnesses. This is to compensate you for any wrong I may have done to you. Abraham told the lie, people. This will settle any claim against me, and your reputation is clear. Then Abraham prayed to God, and God healed Abimelech, his wife, and his female servants so they could have children. For the Lord had caused all the women to be infertile because of what happened with Abraham's wife, Sarah. The grace of God turns sinful behavior into a wealth transference. And then Abraham prayed for Abimelech's house, and then healing and fruitfulness was unleashed in the house of Abimelech. Also note here that this is the first reference of prayer in the scriptures. Anytime we see something referenced for the first time in the scriptures, that means it's telling us something that is critical and vital. So what I'm seeing is Abraham's prayer was still fruitful in spite of his sins. Genesis 21, there's a lot going on in this chapter, but I'm staying on topic. So Genesis 21, Sarah conceives and gives birth to the promise. Grace has made Abraham and Sarah's dream come true. Genesis 21, verses 1 and 2. And the Lord visited Sarah as he has said. And the Lord did unto Sarah as he has spoken. For Sarah conceived and bare Abraham a son in his old age, at the set time in which God has spoken to him. People of God, you can be saved and heaven bound and still live a defeated life. You can live like righteous Lot and get forced into all kinds of uncomfortable and distasteful circumstances, or in some cases, even destruction. You can be a believer, a righteous man, and never see the goodness of the Lord, never see this this various forms of grace that we're talking about, the Bible says that my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge, meaning that if you don't have knowledge and understanding of God's grace in this new covenant, then you are being destroyed, meaning that your life will be plagued with patterns of sickness and disease and destruction. These things will plague your life if you don't have this revelation and this understanding. So I just pray that you take some of these keys I've given you, because when you look at that story of Abraham, Genesis 15, 16, and 17, when you understand what's being set up in those chapters, and then we start looking at the chapters afterwards, the revelation starts oozing. I really had to almost water down all the different things going on in those chapters just so I can stay on topic. The revelation is oozing out of there, especially when you look at Genesis 17 and see this impartation of grace. It changes everything. So I'm just going to close out this and say that drink from the wells of grace and be healthy, be whole, be thriving, be flourishing, be prospering. Zechariah 4:7, grace, grace.